A great deal of rain had fallen in the spring of 1857. We were delayed on the road by high water through Wisconsin. Our train was brought to a sudden stop in the town of Boscobel, Wisconsin, and could proceed no farther on account of the flooded condition of that part of the country between us and where we were to take the steamboat upriver. There were several trainloads of passengers massed in the town. The prospect of starvation presented to us was anything but agreeable to entertain. Men, women, and children were thrown unexpectedly together with very scant accommodations. We were detained at that place for 4 days and nights. Finally, our stay at this point ended by the subsidence of the waters. The next move was to send out a train made up of passenger coaches, all full, bound for Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, situated upon the east shore of the Mississippi. This was the first time in my life to make the acquaintance with the grand old father of the waters. Here we bade goodbye to railroads. After leaving this place, going toward the setting sun, there was not a foot of railroad to be met. From this point, we were to pursue our way by steamboat. We soon had forgotten our mishaps of the past in availing ourselves of the excellent accommodations afforded by our new quarters on the boat. I do not remember anything out of the usual order of events. We landed at the levee of St. Paul, all right, where another mode of locomotion was encountered, the old Concord stagecoach. Thus, with a stage full, we were packed, bag and baggage, bound for St. Anthony Falls. The fare for the trip was $1 apiece.
Took the North Star at 11 o'clock a.m., June 8, 1857. Passed out from the landing just before the steamer H.M. Rice. And stopped on the other side of the river to take aboard freight. When the Rice passed us, we went on after her. We'd gone about 1 mile when we tried to pass her, but she run her bows across our track and ran us ashore. Both boats then tried to run the other ashore for about 6 miles, running against each other most of the way, and the Rice burning tar or rosin to a great extent and carrying so much steam that the engineer put his hat over the gauge in order to hide it from the other passengers. But at last the Star ran the Rice ashore, got ahead of her, and gained about half a mile when we ran into a boom log and bent her rudders so they had to run ashore and take some of the irons back about 5 miles. In company with some ladies, went ashore and had a fine time gathering prairie flowers and playing cards. Started on our way again about 9 p.m. and got along very well. There was a regular Mississippi boat crew aboard who kept up playing cards all night. Arrived at Monticello the next noon.
I wanted to get away before daylight, so I'd not have to see the old home I was leaving forever. But it was a little later than I hoped when we started. The last thing I saw was Father, Mother, and the children standing at the gate. I never saw them again, except Margaret, who came to America after she married John Lucas, and Ellen, who was a widow with 5 daughters. We traveled all day, a distance of about 30 miles, before reaching Dundalk, a small seaport where we took a boat for Liverpool. As the boat got farther from land, I watched the twinkling lights of Dundalk, seeing them dimly through my tears. The last sight of my native land. Traveling on sea 70 years ago was not what it is in these days. Our boat was a sailing vessel, and it took 6 weeks and 3 days to reach New Orleans. There were 300 passengers. When we reached New Orleans, the tide was out, and we had to wait for several hours as the harbor was shallow at low tide. When the tide came in, a tugboat came and towed us to the docks. In about an hour, a riverboat came alongside the ship and took all the passengers who were going to Galena, Illinois, and their belongings. One morning, I went down to the pump on the lower deck to get water for our breakfast. It was still dark, and I stumbled over some object which, when I picked myself up, I discovered to be the body of another victim, a man about 40 years old. We were 3 weeks on the river, just half as long as it took to cross the ocean. Oh, will I ever forget that ride? The roads were frozen and rough. The man had a lumber wagon, and to make it worse, he was drunk. I thought we would be thrown out, so I got down on the bottom of my knees and clung to the sides. All the way, I was suffering. And when we reached Martha's, I was helped out of the wagon. She sent for a neighbour woman, and that night, John was born. Father being in Galena, I went through the ordeal as best I could. We went up the river to St. Paul, and then took passage on a very small steamer to Bloomington Ferry on the Minnesota River. Freight had to be distributed carefully, or the boat would tip over. Frequently, the passengers ran from side to balance it. Several times on the trip, the boiler sprang a leak, causing a panic among the passengers. It was patched up as well as possible each time with bags of sand tied around the break, and they filled the boiler with buckets. After many delays, we reached Bloomington Ferry 3 days and a half after we started. A few hours should have accomplished it. The boat went on as far as Shakopee, and on the return trip, it sank and was never used again. Wasn't that a narrow escape?
Scarcely were we underway than a snowstorm of a severity such as I had never before experienced in the Northwest closed in around us. The wind blew with such a terrific velocity over the open prairie, and the frozen snow beat down with such cruel force that one dared not expose his face or hands. I tried to balance upon my lap a bandbox in which I was carrying some feminine finery. In an unguarded moment, the wind lifted up the box and strewed its contents in shreds far out over the prairie. The men in the front seats attempted to protect themselves with umbrellas. The wind and snow riddled the covers as if they were paper. All day long we faced this terrible pelting fire of frozen snow. At the next stopping place, the sled was abandoned, that the remainder of the journey might be made in a covered wagon. The road was merely a trail that went over or around hills as was most convenient, through brush and across fords. From early thaws, the way was washed full of ruts and hollows. The wheels stuck deep in the mud or slid sideways down steep embankments. We were jolted and jarred and pitched from one side to the other of the wagon. Sometimes the vehicle was overturned. Again, the wheels were so deep in the mud that all the passengers were compelled to get out in order that it might be moved. Once, we were in water over the hubs of the wheels, and at another time, the wagon and horses were almost carried downstream by the force of the current.
Into the rickety stagecoach, crowded and ill-ventilated, the rain trickled in little turbid streams, and so softened the cerements of many an oath bound up in the bosom of a Buckeye from Cleveland that they came forth in full feather at every jolt. The language was objectionable, but the sentiment was natural. For a slower coach with worse accommodations never tortured poor traveler more than did the one in which we were packed like sacks of salt. Relief came. An axle of the coach snapped in twain, and we traveled the remainder of the journey to Galena in a farmer's open wagon, enjoying the delights of fresh air and clear water direct from the clouds. Earth, sky, jokes, and sympathies were all leaden in aspect as we approached the Galenic metropolis, and as silent and forlorn as a funeral cortege, we rode half a night in that open vehicle, unpitied except by the clouds that wept over us.
Next show's at 4:30.